Cool. Thank you. My name is Alexander Adames. I'm a postdoc here in the Department of Sociology. Our panel will consist of, is that the order one? Yeah. Okay. Gunnar Anderson, who is a professor of demography and the head of demography at Stockholm University. He coordinates research projects in register-based demographic research and is involved in research programs with a focus on fertility, aging, migrant trajectories, and residential segregation. And next, afterward, we'll have Wendy Manning, who is the Dr. Howard Aldrich and Penny Dom Aldrich Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Bowling Green State University, and was previously president of PAA. She has made contributions to the study of diverse families, cohabitation, and family formation processes and their consequences. And lastly, we have Joel. Oh, okay. Joel Middleman, who is the William P. and Hazel B. White Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. Using novel methods in computational social science, Middleman examines gender inequality in schools and society with a focus on the LGBTQ populations.
Then I start clicking here. So I'm Gunnar from, it's a picture from Stockholm University. No, it's not Stockholm University. It's Stockholm in late winter. And I am a demographer from the demography unit over there. And I have worked with family demographic research for several decades. My main focus has been on fertility and fertility trends in European settings. I worked a little bit on marriage and divorce, comparably in a comparative setting in Europe. My passion for marriage and divorce was maybe a little bit less than that of fertility until the introduction of same-sex marriages that brought in new heterogeneities and new diversity and new perspectives and excitement to this field of research. I will do a little bit of the trajectory how I work with this. So first, the context is Sweden. So I work with Swedish data. We have very good Swedish demographic data, both from historical until modern times. So the data collection started in 1749, and here you can see the crude marriage trends in Sweden over the decades since 1750. I will not cover those, but those, what matter is perhaps this, the decline in marriage rates in the 1960s and 70s that put Sweden on the agenda. And there seemed to be a decline in the role of marriage and replaced by non-marital cohabitation in this setting. And then there are a lot of other things happen, including trend reversals in marriage in the general population. This is the trends in divorces in Sweden from 1900 onwards. And this was then also at the same time in the 1960s and 70s, there were increases in divorces, that there is also less entries into marriage, but it's also possibilities to leave marriages. And this was part of the so-called second demographic transition that brought in more diversity in family forms in these European settings. And then Sweden, at least in the European setting, got a little bit reputation to be a forerunner in different family demographic trends. So already in 1915, there was a relatively modern divorce legislation, so it's possible to file for a divorce without necessarily stating that there was some criminal offense behind it. In the 1960s, there were increase in non-marital cohabitation. And in the 1970s, there were welfare state reforms that made the role of marriage more or less disappear. So the social rights are tied to the individual, and it doesn't matter economically if you are married or not. So this doesn't have an impact on taxation. It doesn't have an impact on things like very important, like in the US with healthcare and insurance. So it's all, and also pension rights are on the individual. And in 1974, then there was a modern legislation that took away the last more historical awkward things from marriage and divorce. So, and then in 1995, then was this next step in the family demographic trends with the introduction of same-sex partnerships. And this was the de facto same-sex marriages. The word partnership was an invention done in Denmark linguistically to make it more easier to pave the way and remove resistance for about the sacred marriage. And in 2000, and then after that, then the motion got rolling with different reforms and more democratization, equalization of marriage. And 2009, then also the term was, and the legislations was in a true gender-neutral marriage legislation. So this also fits a little bit with this idea about that new family demographic trends start a little bit in Northern Europe and then they diffuse across Europe, and maybe 20, 30 years later they reach Italy or Greece and so on. Greece actually voted just this year to introduce also same-sex marriages. We have talked already before in the previous session about data issues on same-sex couples. There are problems with family surveys, with a little bit ambiguities in definitions when people do self-declared family status. Also with census data and with this minority population, there is also a lot of potential for misreporting and underreporting of same-sex couples. And in standard family surveys, the numbers are usually too small and also a lot of scope for misreporting. And some of the surveys are snowball samples that one doesn't really know what does these surveys data population, what they reflect. And then we thought we could do a really contribution based on the system with Swedish and Nordic register data with my colleagues in Norway. Because then there are no ambiguities. We have register data on distinct civil status changes, entry into same-sex marriages, partnerships, and then divorces, exit from same-sex marriage partnerships. There are no missing data. It's a total population, and it's also for the demography is really nice because it's longitudinal data, so we can work with longitudinal time to event analysis of these populations. Okay, and then of course it's a lot of potential for demographic research to look at this. If we have this data, we have new insights into the family lives of same-sex couples in a Nordic setting, and also new insights into the motivations for marriage and divorce that can be applied to the general population, the role of gender in couple dynamics, the role of childbearing in relation to marriage, and also different policy changes, how they affect the demographic trends, family demographic trends. So we did the first study on, it was in the demography in 2006, with really, would say, first national totally reliable statistical analysis of same-sex marriage dynamics. And that was a study with my colleagues in Norway and Sweden. And we could see first simple descriptors, who were the new marriages, how do they differ, same characteristics on place of residence, ages, migration background, socioeconomic characteristics, and so on. And then, since it was then national data, it can validate descriptors that are coming from other smaller survey sources. And and the patterns were not no big surprises, but you can really validate that this, what you usually know, is how it looks like. But what was new was that we could then do the first study on divorce risks in same-sex couples. So we follow couples over time and see what's happening with the dissolution risks. And then it looks like this, so there are huge differences between couples of two men and couples of two women. So that is the main finding. So Norway and Sweden, the divorce risks are about double as high in couples of two women than in couples of two men. And we had also replicated another study that the same patterns is in Denmark. And these patterns have later on been replicated in other contexts. It's not something that is unique for the Scandinavian setting. And I think it's also interesting because somehow it reflects what is going on in heterosexual unions. There it's most women are usually said to be more sensitive to relationship qualities, and they are the one who in most cases initiate the divorce. So when there are two women, then you have double up. So that was not necessarily given from the outset. One doesn't know if people would behave in these gendered ways, but it gives inputs on the gender dynamics in couples. So, and then we ended up, we presented this, I remember, at the PAA, and then we know about these moral majority movements, and we were a little bit nervous, oh, maybe we will lynch at the PAA, but of course it was very civilized at the PAA. But then I found this draw into the as Gary said, science meet politics, and then we were exposed to different kind of reactions to our findings. So, so then, if divorce is something embarrassing or something morally wrong, there seems to be, people seem to agree maybe on both sides on this idea. So, but the main pattern, of course, so then it was also used whether if divorces were higher in same-sex than in opposite-sex marriages, and whether this should have some argument for the legalization of same-sex marriages, which of course is bizarre, because first, the differences between couples of two women and two men is much, much bigger than the difference between some average of these couples and the opposite-sex marriages. If one should use these logics, then it should be only allowed for men to marry because they don't initiate as others. And also from an American perspective, then the argument should be you should outlaw marriage altogether because divorce risks are so much higher in the US than in other modern society. Okay, and then the next, and we also got some reactions a little bit on the general marriage trends. And Sweden has sometimes been put out as the end of the family and the end of civilization. And then whether this, with the introduction of same-sex marriage, then would contribute to this trends, and we got questions about this. And I don't think so, but maybe have a look. And then we put together this diagram. We had a look. These are then the total first marriage rates in the 3 Nordic countries, and the arrows there are the introduction of same-sex marriages. And then you can see very peculiar in all 3 countries, there was a trend reversal in opposite-sex marriages. I don't claim there's any causality behind this, but it could be that the attention in the media and so on about same-sex marriages, popularization of marriage, there are actually some people who want to marry and think that this is something exciting and not something that is totally outdated and belongs to the history. Could have contributed to the popularity of marriages. But I'll show another picture later on that there are also other trends that we see are going on. So, okay, but at least we could reply to that kind of questions. So then we did a follow-up later with Martin Kolk, a colleague at Stockholm University, that was published in 2020, also in Demography. And then we could see a little bit more long-term trends, and we could see whether the old patterns on the early years, whether they were stable or whether they have changed later on. And then we also, we did a little bit update. So we did demographic rates, not only on the divorce risks, but also on the marriage formation intensity. So we studied then the relative risks of forming a marriage based on the risk population of those who are not married. And then we have a longer period. So then we could also look at particular on the trends in marriage, same-sex marriage formation. And then during this period, there was a lot of policy reforms. There were policy reforms in relation to parenting rights, so making it easier for adoption and insemination in same-sex couples, female couples. And there was also then a change in the label of marriage in 2009. So yeah, the label of marriage and partnership is mainly semantics, but since the contents of the economic contents of marriage in Sweden doesn't matter so much, maybe semantics are important in that context. So that we wanted to see. So, and then here are the trends in marriage formation from 1995 to 2012 for women and men. And you can see you can see that women are not only more prone to divorce, but they are also much more prone to marry. So it's really a feminization of same-sex marriage risk, and the women trends are popping up here. It's more flat for the men. There's a little bit of trend reversals in the last years, and when we did this, we didn't know that if this was just a blip or anything, but it looks like there is a little bit declining trends afterwards that goes together with the new declining trends in opposite-sex marriages in Sweden, so that these trends are following each other. But then we can put in here the different policy interventions. So the purple lines are the policy changes in relation to parenthood, and the green line is the intervention in relation to changing the label from partnership to marriage. And it looks like it's really something with relation to parenthood and the possibility to have children that is driving the increase in same-sex marriages for women. So that is becoming important, because then you need to be married in order to have adoption and assisted reproduction in the beginning. While, yeah, okay, while the change in the legislation of the label of marriage, the more symbolic function, didn't seem to have an impact. The trends are just continuing. Yeah, okay, and here are then the divorce risks. There are annual risk, a little bit small and jumpy numbers, but you can see that the curve for the men is approaching the general population of opposite-sex couples, and the divorces of women are still considerably higher. So women are more prone to marry and more prone to divorce, which also reflects a little bit what is going on in opposite-sex unions. Maybe I'll skip this a little bit or do it very quickly. I just wanted to show this is the general population of opposite-sex marriage and fertility, total first marriage rates and the total fertility rates. And as a demographer in Sweden, we think that these things are totally disconnected, has nothing to do with each other. But if you look at this on the aggregate level, they move together, even if the timing of marrying and having a child is not very strongly linked. And here is a picture showing increases. The blue line there is increases in women in same-sex marriages to have a child in the 5 years after getting married. And there are 2 women in each relationship. So if you add the 2 women, then you will come up to almost 50%, and that is almost the same as women in opposite-sex couples. But then the difference is what happened before, because women in the opposite-sex couples usually have children before they marry, and women in same-sex couples, maybe 20% have children before, and for the men, maybe 10% have children before, either from a previous heterosexual union or otherwise. And the childbearing in male unions is negligible because it's very difficult to organize in different ways. So yeah, strong links. Yeah, I will summarize this here, because there are then strong links between marriage and childbearing, both in same-sex couples for the women and also in opposite-sex couples, maybe more than what we usually think. And for same-sex parents, then there are strong incentives to marry before becoming a parent, because it makes it easier to organize with adoption and things like that. That was very difficult otherwise. More similarities. There are new trend directions in the 2010s that I don't have data for, but I have colleagues, Stephanie Mulgorn and Martin Kolk, working on this. And at the PA, I will present the new marriage trends for opposite sex couples. So, but there is a new trends, and that go to learn together with fertility trends in Sweden and also in the US. There are similar trends. And there was an additional dip in marriages during the pandemic years, but only temporarily, because then you could not organize with festivities and have nice marriage parties. Okay, increasing feminization of same-sex union dynamics. I think that is very interesting. Higher levels of marriage formation and higher divorce risks. And that points to some similarities in the gender behavior in same-sex and opposite-sex couples that at least were more similar than maybe I would expect from the beginning when I started working on this. Okay, and then one last slide on empirics. I was in Germany last week, and then we had the German Demographic Society with the Nordic Demographic Societies in my session. There were several nice contributions from my colleague in Stockholm University. This is one of them, Marie Evertsson, who uses then the same-sex couples as an example of how doing gender and how do earnings develop in relation to childbirth in same-sex and opposite-sex couples. And the orange line is the differences between men and women in earnings in different sex couples, where women dip in earnings when they have a child, and then they don't recover that much. While in same-sex couples, the birth mother has a temporary dip, but then return to more equality. They have done this also for the other Nordic countries, and when you dig more, then these differences become less visible than what it looks here. Yeah. So it's an interesting context what you can do by looking on gender in same-sex couples. And this is then the last slide. There are some limitations. So of course with this, we have very strong data, but it is with explicit focus on civil status changes. So we don't have data on same-sex cohabitation. It's not an official status in the registers, and just by linking to persons of the same sex living in the same apartment, that will be very diluted, the data. So, but there are other data sources in Europe. We have the generation and gender surveys that we relatively long ago managed to introduce that you define the sex of your couples, and that is explicit, that you don't have heteronormative answers in that survey. For each country, the data are too small to do something, but if you pool data from several countries, then you can also do some nice statistical analysis. And in the German socioeconomic panel study, they have, I just learned this, they have a sample where they have oversampled people with their self-declared sexual orientation. And there was actually a study on this in the last online version in the European Journal Population with panel data. And then you could then also look on the earlier stages in the couple formation process on dating, moving together, cohabitation, and into marriage. So the previous steps we cannot do with the register data, but this study provided a little bit nice additional information. And I think Wendy is coming next, maybe have something on that also. Yes. So then I conclude with this picture, and then I leave it over to Wendy.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's a great privilege to be here today. I thought I'd walk you through two basic questions, and I think Gunnar has really lined this up nicely for me. I'm going to talk about computing marriage and divorce rates in the United States, and then also reflect on that and think about my perspective on queering family demography. I need to start by acknowledging many great people that I've worked with, including Gary, who's here, on many of these questions, and especially I want to mention Dr. Krista Westrick-Payne at Bowling Green. We're using a lot of census and administrative data on a number of projects together, and she's been a great colleague. So when we think about family demography, and I've heard some conversations about even what is demography today, and I can't quite go down that path with all of you, but I really want to argue that family demography is super important because most demographic events occur within a familial context. We really think a core feature of demographic work is accurate measurement of what is. But of course, in order to know what is, you have to ask about it. You have to ask about it appropriately, as many of you have mentioned today. And it resonates with that theme, I think, of to be counted, you have to count. You must be counted to count. And I think Gary said that as well as others. And so I think it's a really important theme to remember. Our field is dynamic. The origins are marriage-centered. We did start out in the 1960s with sort of the origin of this field. And I think we need to remain marriage-centered in the US context in particular, because that's where a lot of legal rights are obtained is through marriage, and certainly the formation of LGBTQ plus families is largely approved through marriage, as well as other important rights that are guaranteed to those people who are married. But certainly cohabitation is an important theme that I'll come back to. And I wanted to review and also want to mention something that Gunnar talked about is a core part of demography is understanding the population who's exposed to an event. So I can't get divorced unless I'm married, right? And so that's the when we talk about at risk, we're not meaning it in a negative way. We're really meaning it. It's just that you're the people who can actually get, if I never get married, then I just simply can't get divorced. And so we really need to think about these populations when we're trying to understand rates of marriage, and some of our core demographic techniques are reliant on that. And so this is called, and a lot of us refer to this as the denominator issue in demography. We've had a couple of happy accidents, and Gary talked about one earlier today about the decennial census, including these questions about unmarried partners. And I don't think the people who did that thought that we were going to then use that to measure same-sex cohabiting couples. We have now moved to a very intentional approach with the 2020 decennial census and the 2019 ACS, where we asked, as he's queued me up nicely, where we asked very directly about, are you living with an opposite sex, same sex spouse, husband, wife, or unmarried partner? And so that's been a happy accident. I think another happy unintentional accident by census folks was including marital events in the 2008 census, ACS. This was in response to some shortcomings in our vital statistics system, where we weren't really getting accurate numbers of the number of marriages and divorces across states. And so they started asking about, did you get married, divorced, or widowed in the last 12 months? There was a movement to remove these questions in 2014. It was fought off bravely by many of us family demographers, as well as a number of other people who were very interested in making sure that the federal government counted marriage. And there are other questions on there that we're able to use to understand marriages amongst same-sex couples. And but again, I don't think that was intentional at the time of the survey, that we were going to be so actively using these data for those purposes. So when I say that, the color don't come up that great. When we talk about vital statistics, this is work that Krista has done. There's only about 20 states that you can actually count the number of marriages to same-sex couples from the vital stat system, and only 5 states when we think about divorce. So that number 5 will come up again when I try to give you some estimates on divorce, and you can see there are a wide and varied number of states that have divorce statistics. I don't have time to review the expansion of data that can be used to understand same-sex couples, LGBTQ individuals and their families, but there's been a growing number of studies. And I'd like to use this short time to say that the NCHAT data with Claire Camp-Dutch is one such data set where we really tried to overcome some of the limitations in the field. We acknowledge it's not perfect, and we hope that you decide to download the data. We have over 7,000 downloads. It includes a survey of a respondent, partner, time diary, contextual data, and biomarker data. So quick ad for the NCHAT. But when we're thinking about marriages, we really need to think about marriages in the last year. And so we have to have a really large data set in order to be able to do that. I can't just use a small sample of 1,000 married couples, because only about 10% of same-sex couples got married last year, of all married couples got married last year, and only about 3% of different sex couples got married in the last year. So I need a really large data set. The American Community Survey can offer this. This is showing you trends in the counts of marriages. You can see on the left are different sex couples, on the right are same-sex couples. You can see a similar dipping during the pandemic and a slight rebound afterwards. And so there, in 2022, there were about 73,000 marriages to same-sex couples. These are really hard to estimate prior to 2019 because of indirect methods that were used. And so we're really appreciative of having these direct estimates. And so these represent about 4% of marriages last year in the in 2022 in the United States. And they're sort of evenly divided between male same-sex couples and female same-sex couples. And so you might think, wow, the marriage rates are really similar for male and female same-sex couples, but Gunnar was already has stolen my thunder there. It's not. But I'm glad to have that confirmed. Some other information we have from these data that I think are really important when you're trying to study marriages and families is we know about marital histories, and we know that about a third of different sex couples and about a third of female same-sex couples have been married prior to their most recent marriage. And I think we often think about everybody's entering their first glorious marriage, but it's not really true. And so that's important to consider, especially when we're thinking about age of marriage. So we know that people in remarriages get married at older ages. So if we just look at first marriages, we can see that same-sex couples are getting married at older ages than different sex couples. But at the remarriage stage, it's about the same. The ages aren't that different. And these ages of marriage are really important when we're trying to understand the distribution of people who are married, the distribution of people who are at risk of getting divorced, even the distribution of people who are at risk of getting married. I'm typing fast. Another feature that I want to really point out, something that we kind of discovered by accident. It's so obvious now, but I would say that's what a lot of my research has been. I go in there and I discover, oh my gosh, I don't know why I didn't think of this at the outset. But this is one about marital duration, and of course, given the Obergefell decision in the United States, the median duration of marriages of same-sex couples is relatively short. It's only going to be about 4 years. Makes complete sense. And for different sex couples, it's about 20 years. And so if you're going to compare different sex and same-sex married couples, these are really apples and oranges. And just looking at marital duration itself is, I think, really important. And you'll see these 5 states that are going to come up again, but they have a similar pattern. And these are the only states we're going to know about divorce, unlike in Sweden, which has the ideal data set, which I wish we had here. So another feature that I really want to talk about here is the importance of cohabitation and understanding co-residential relationships for different sex couples and same-sex couples. It's often overlooked. We've quickly moved to marriage. And I think what we all might appreciate is in young adulthood, there's high rates of cohabitation, large shares of different sex couples who are in a relationship are cohabiting. But for different sex couples, as they move through the life course, those diminish. And you can see for female and male same-sex couples, those patterns aren't quite the same. They're peak. They are highest in young adulthood, but still in their 50s, about 30% of same-sex couples who are in co-residential relationships are cohabiting. And so we can't just think about co-residential relationships. We can't think about just families and think about marriage. We really need to incorporate cohabitation into that question. I think also this shows you that we have to think about age. We can see these really strong differences in age patterns, and we know that very well in family demography. But I think in what I've seen a lot of work on same-sex couples, people are not accounting for age at which these events are occurring, and I think that's really, really critical. In the interest of time, I'll not talk about children, but if that comes up, I have some questions I can answer on that. But I think a big theme that we really want to think about is who are these unmarried folks who are at risk of getting married? And if you think of marriage as a bad thing, we can think about risk as negative, but I'm really just saying who's exposed. And we can't use the American Community Survey to do this, right? So this is very disgruntled. It's just our whole thoughts about understanding marriage and divorce rates are really hampered by the data infrastructure we face in the United States. And so here we're using the Household Pulse Survey. And the Household Pulse Survey is great because it asks about sexual identity. And it was initiated during the pandemic. And it's released in real time. It's released very quickly, but there's some shortcomings with it. One that I would argue strongly is it doesn't include questions about cohabitation. So I can only know about marriage and sexual identity using the household pulse survey, where with the American Community Survey, I can understand about marriage and cohabitation, but not about single people. And so what you can see here, though, pretty clearly is that at all ages, that gay men are more likely to be unmarried at any point than any other group that we can observe here. And in young adulthood, we expect most people to be unmarried. They're not yet, given that the median age at marriage in the United States is 28 for women and 30 for men. And I showed you those differences for same sex and different sex couples. But as we move through the life course, we still see some of those differentials kind of emerge a little more strongly. And even into their 50s, we see some higher shares of lesbian women and gay men are still unmarried, and relatively low levels among straight males. And some of this is first marriages, and some of these are remarriages. So this is a population who's at risk of marriage. So then the next step is to think about, well, then we can compute marriage rates. This demography, we know we have a count of the number of people who are experiencing an event, and the denominator is those who are exposed to experiencing it. We can come up with marriage rates. And so that's what Krista and I have tried to do. We realize there's some shortcomings with our approach. We tried a few different scenarios to try to work through this, but basically you can see, and this echoes what we just heard, that for gay males, we see quite low marriage rates across any age group. We see quite high rates of marriage in the younger years for straight females, given the gender differences and sex differences we observe in marriage and the age of marriage. And you can see when you get into these older years that we have some differences, and that's really due to who's exposed to experiencing this event. And so my argument here is that we need to consider age over time. We need to think about who's exposed and who's at risk of experiencing the event. And we also have to think about sex or gender and their sexual identity. And so something that we have tried to do is then compute divorce rate. And we do not know the gender composition or the sex composition of couples using vital stats data. And so this is what Krista and I had to use. She has reached out to every state in the country, and all we know right now are just the number of divorces that are same-sex couples in these 5 states. And we can't figure out what these states have in common. It's odd combination of states, if you ask me. But basically, when you use the denominator of among people who are married, and the numerator is the number of divorces, we can see that among same-sex couples that we observe higher rates of divorce than we do among different sex couples. Now, as I've already shown you, though, not all married, the population of people who are married, different sex couples, are quite different than the population of same-sex couples who are married. Their marriages have lasted a long time, and something we do know about divorce is after you reach that the divorce rates really decline. There's sort of a peak in divorce at about maybe 12 or 13 years of marriage, and then it very much declines over time. And so that if you really just looked at all marriages that occurred from 2004 to 2019, thinking maybe about the legalization of marriage in Massachusetts to the most recent time, that really the divorce rates observed for same-sex couples are what we would observe in the population. And so you really have to account for how long the couple has been together. Now, this would be ideal if we had some super survey to do that, but we don't. And so this is what we're kind of left with here. And we have maybe more questions than answers, but I've posed this to you because I think it creates some new opportunities to challenge what kind of data we're going to collect in the future. So with the time remaining, I just want to talk to you a little bit about being more intentional in our data collections, that we've really stitched together a patchwork of data here. I've tried to show you an example of this, asking the most basic question about marriage and divorce and how we simply can't do that with what we have available right now in the States, but that we have some new opportunities. And we're gonna, I think all of this will help us understand all families, not just LGBTQ+ individuals and their families. And I think that's important because we're evolving quite a bit, and there's a lot of debates about the well-being of children and adults across family types. So some things that we can do are intentional, or have inclusive surveys. Our surveys are so heteronormative. I couldn't believe it when Claire and I were working with the NCHAT. We worked so hard to make this a more inclusive survey, and we thought we were almost done, and then we realized we were asking about mothers and fathers at the end of the survey. We're like, wait, we can't do that. Not everybody, and so it was really a big challenge and harder, and I think something that we all need to do better and be intentional about at the outset of our data collections. We need to reconceptualize family relationships. I made an argument about cohabitation and duration of relationship, but also domestic partnerships are legal in some states, and they're sort of akin to marriage. And that I haven't seen very many people pay attention to those at all. We need to think about polyamory and even consensual non-monogamous relationships. That's left out of most of our surveys. The NCHAT, we try to get at polyamory. We have a biological basis for our relationships to children and parents, so we sort of privilege biological ties, but that doesn't really make sense in a lot of families. And then we also ignore voluntary families or families by choice. And then when we think about relationships, I was really impressed with Erin Lavender Stott, who wrote a piece on queering singlehood, and she talked about a relationship escalator and how we are always thinking about marriage as the ultimate outcome of all relationships, and that's not really appropriate when we're thinking more broadly about families. And we need to kind of question that as the ultimate outcome, and we probably should think harder about when we're looking at these relationship histories. Who are those prior partners in terms of their gender and sexual identity, and trying to incorporate longitudinal data or histories of relationships. And so some people like Ariane Ophir has done a great job of that with her work in the UK. Also, even though I've just argued we should consider more polyamorous types of relationships, when we take a couple perspective, which we were able to do with the NCHAT, we found with Chris Julian that the share of LGBTQ plus couples doubled when we considered both partners' sexual identity and not just one partner. Not everybody is partnered with someone of the same sexual identity. And in fact, and I think that's really an oversight that seems sort of obvious now, but something we need to think harder about. And we're not even sure that using proxy reports is going to be great at that. And then also being more broad in our sense of, I've talked exclusively about same-sex and different-sex couples. Of course, those are binaries, and we really need to think more broadly about transgender and gender, being more inclusive about gender nonconforming individuals and those who have non-binary identities. This is what might seem like a really boring topic, is weighting. Everybody thinks like it doesn't matter. This is used to ensure that survey data are representative. We're doing that based on sex from the census. Now that's okay, but that might not be for some research, but for the kinds of research that people in this room want to do, I don't know if that's really appropriate. And so we have to really, I think, question that. I don't know, I don't have a great answer, but we probably should rethink some of that. And then in the interest of time, we also are thinking about comparisons across groups. We often pick what we consider the largest group as our reference category. That becomes then some sort of normative comparison, which is inappropriate. And so we are now turning, I think, more to thinking about variation among groups and limiting our samples sometimes to LGBTQ plus folks. Is really useful, but that elusive reviewer 2 hates that idea. And so we're still struggling with this, but trying to understand how mechanisms that are specific to LGBTQ populations operate is really important for those kinds of questions. And we're often confounding sexual identities and gender composition, that certainly there's a Venn diagram where there's a lot of overlap, but they don't perfectly align with one another. And then 2 more slides. One is finally that context matters. We're working with Kara Joyner on a lot of work related to cis heterosexism measures, trying to apply those to different data sets. And we know a lot about legal and policy environments at the state level. Right now, according to ACLU, there's 479 anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States, just in the 2024 legislative session. Social context matters in terms of the neighborhoods where we live. the political attitudes and attitudes about LGBT specific relationships. And just as I learned today from someone in the audience who's confronting that. So I think overall, we want to, we can't apply traditional family demographic blueprint on studying LGBTQ individuals and families. And I think though we have a lot of promise future, I try to go with the glass half full that everybody seems to be doing. So I thought I can do that too. So this is my effort. Like, I think we have a lot of new opportunities and excitement coming forward. At PAA, there's going to be a lot of great sessions on this. So I hope you will participate in those. We have at NCFR, we have family profiles that are dedicated to this topic. Again, I encourage you to consider the NCHAT data as a data source, and to also just send me your work and any questions you have if we don't get a chance to cover them today. So thank you.
I'm so grateful to be here, and I really regret that I'm unable to be joining this gathering in person. I've so enjoyed the day just watching on my computer screen. It's such a special gathering of scholars that I admire so much. So thank you so much to Chris Velasco for organizing this and for inviting me. And I'm excited to share some work that I started when I was at Princeton OPR. So when I was thinking about what to share for this, I thought that this was a good project to share because I think it draws out a couple of points that have been made throughout the day, including in this session. One of which is that, making queer lives visible in our data and studying them as demographers is important, not just in and of itself, but because queer lives offer a really important vantage point on reconsidering a lot of core demographic patterns and processes. And I think especially they encourage new ways of thinking about gender and capturing the dynamics of gender inequality. So something I like to say is that I think that the new visibility of LGBT lives in our data is not just an opportunity to study queer people, it's also an invitation to study all people in more queer ways. And so that requires, as we've all discussed today, new kinds of data, but I think it also encourages new approaches to the data we've already have to try to tell some new kinds of gender stories using existing data sources. So that's enough preamble. Let me get into it. Okay, so if you know anything about the academic gender gap, you will know that once again, our boys are in crisis. You may have seen this viral Wall Street Journal article from 2021 announcing that a generation of American men had given up on college. The article explained that men now trail female college students by record levels, and that if current trends continue, in the next few years, 2 women will earn a college degree for every 1 man. So although the magnitude of this college gender gap has changed, the gap itself is old news. So already in 2006, the cover of Newsweek magazine announced that there was a boy crisis in education. They explained that by almost every benchmark, boys across the country and in every demographic group were falling behind. So if you ask a sociologist what's going on here with this long-standing demographic trend, they'll tell you that this is a story about masculinity and not a simple fact of biological maleness. So what do I mean by that? So for sociologists, boys' underachievement comes from the way that masculinity is constructed and enforced, right? It comes from the norms and the pressures and the payoffs of how we come to define masculinity in peer groups. And not that this consistent underperformance is not a simple hardwired fact of biology, right? And to substantiate that perspective, sociologists appeal to this long-standing ethnographic tradition we have, analyzing the cultures of boys in and around schools. So this is a literature that Dupreet and Buckman in their book, The Rise of Women, summarizes saying that much of the male disadvantage in education can be traced to the peer culture that provides status rewards for an oppositional attitude towards school. So theoretically here, sociologists have always maintained this sharp distinction between sex and gender, arguing that the gender gaps that we see are related to gender norms and not biological sex. And yet, empirically, when we go to substantiate this in population research, we're confronted with a situation like this, where all of our gender stories about the gender gap in education are built on top of questions that look something like this. Male, female, mark one, right? So no distinction here between sex and gender, no curiosity about categories beyond male and female, no recognition of the great amount of variability within these binary categories, just two starkly dichotomous groups and a mandate that respondents have to pick between one or the other. And so empirically, despite this theoretical orientation, when we go to study the gender gap in population research, population inequality research, we're collapsing sex and gender into this single binary variable. So a queer perspective encourages us to move beyond this. I think a queer perspective encourages a lot of new ways of thinking about gender, brings our attention to new kinds of gender dynamics, but a core one is that it's deeply suspicious of binaries. And it says we need to move beyond thinking about simple binary categories and instead find a way to analyze academic inequality along a spectrum of masculinity and femininity, and not simply between categorically defined males and females. So that's the background that motivates the two research questions I'll address in the brief time I have with you. So the first is, how's the intersection of sex and sexuality structure academic success in America? And then the second question is, how might we analyze academic inequality along a spectrum rather than just collapsing it into a binary? So to address that first question, I'm bringing together here three large nationally representative data sets that, thanks in part to the work of people gathered together in the room there just starting in the second Obama administration, a lot of these big federally sponsored national household surveys started asking about sexual orientation for the first time. And so I pool every wave that was available at the time I was doing the study to get around 500,000 respondents across these three large nationally representative household surveys. And then I complement that with the high school longitudinal study of 2009, which is a US Department of Education sponsored high school cohort study. It's the first such study that asked about student sexual orientation. So what I'm going to show you here are regression adjusted results. So among all American adults, I don't have so many controls, but I control in each study for race, ethnicity, age, and nativity. And then within the HSLS, I have a richer set of controls for family background. And I also have high school fixed effects. So I'm comparing gay and lesbian students to observably similar straight students within the same school. All right, so if you look across these national household surveys at the full population of American adults, and I should have said here, I do a lot in the paper, but here I'm focusing just on contemporary cohorts, so people born after 1980. And so a few patterns emerge here that are fairly well replicated across all the data sets. The first is that straight women outpace straight men. So here we have, the underperformance of boys reflected. In two of the three data sets, we see that straight women outpace lesbian women. Lesbian women have a disadvantage in two of the three data sets. But one group stands above them all, which is gay men outpace all other groups. And then as we move into the HSLS study, which is a nationally representative cohort of kids who were in 9th grade in 2009, followed up through college, we see the same pattern replicated. So as straight women's educational attainment has continued to rise, they now decisively outpace both straight men and lesbian women, but still almost to the point estimate, gay men rise above all the other groups. And so I would pause just to emphasize the magnitude of the effect here. So in a context where there's this renewed public attention and public concern about the underperformance of boys in education, I estimate that about 53% of gay men in America have at least a college degree. And for context, so 53% of gay men have a college degree, about 36% of all American adults have a college degree. And at 36%, America is ninth in the world in educational attainment. But if America's gay men form their own country, it would be the world's most highly educated country by far. So a staggeringly high level of educational success here, not just by domestic standards, but international standards as well. So we can call Newsweek magazine and say, actually, it's not the case that boys are behind in every demographic group. There's one demographic group that has been historically invisible to us, and they're absolutely crushing it in education. So within the HSLS, I complement those big, 500,000 people educational attainment analyses with a richer set of educational outcomes. So I look at kids' GPAs, their attitudes related to how important school is, and how academically oriented their closest friends are. And across these outcomes, we see the same pattern where compared to observably similar straight boys in the same school, gay boys have much better grades, they're more invested in the importance of education, and they have their closest friends are much more academically oriented. And for lesbian girls compared to straight girls, we have this consistent pattern of disadvantage across all of these measures. And yet, in the same data set where we see this big asymmetry academically, when you shift the gaze and focus not on academic outcomes, but the broader social experience of school, that asymmetry falls apart. And both gay boys and lesbian girls are significantly more likely to report that they feel unsafe in school, that discrimination has limited their educational opportunities, and that they have trouble concentrating on their schoolwork because of mental health challenges. So it's an academic specific asymmetry here that should not be interpreted as saying, well, actually, I guess maybe school isn't as bad as we might have thought for gay boys. Their success is coming despite the fact that they're overcoming all of these social and emotional challenges that are persistent in American schools. So to summarize so far, I think that these results give us a chance to see gender from the margins. That whereas existing research on the academic gender gap has documented the consequences of hegemonic gender norms, by making sexuality visible and studying gay and lesbian students, it allows us to see the impact of being marginalized from those norms. And more specifically, my theory is that to the extent that gay and lesbian students feel alienated from or excluded by the gender norms that are dominant among their schoolmates, this should have an asymmetric effect academically. It should be beneficial for boys, given the relationship between masculinity and educational engagement, but it could be risky for girls. And socially, that asymmetry wouldn't be the same, that for both boys and girls being distant from dominant gender norms could be socially risky. So this is, I think, an intuitively compelling explanation for these results. But as I've said, a queer perspective encourages us to move beyond just being satisfied with these binary categories and stacking intersections on top of each other, and instead thinking about how we can more directly capture these gender dynamics. So how might we go about trying to analyze inequality along a spectrum? So if I look in the HSLS data set that I'm working with, initially the situation looks bleak. We have all that it presents to us is the same old, what is your sex, male, female, choose one. And yet, that question is just one. It's actually literally the first question on the study. It's so important that people announce their binary sex category that it's the first thing we make them do. But it's just one of a great many questions on these surveys. So according to the user guide here, among the things that are on this study are students' values and goals, their interests, their extracurricular experiences, et cetera, et cetera. Over pages and pages of these surveys, there's a total of 759 wide-ranging questions that students are filling out. And together, those questions have about 7,000 distinct answer choices. So my intuition here is there some way that we can leverage all of this additional data to get us some sense of where students fall within the gender norms of their peers? And so I asked, taking an inductive and data-driven approach, how might we measure the gender norms being reported in these surveys? And so to answer that question, I turn to the tools of machine learning. So I apply what I call a gender predictive approach, where I train a machine learning model to take in a student's full set of survey responses, so all 7,000 distinct answer choices, and then output a single summary prediction of how likely it is that the student reported being in a given sex category. So what this looks like in the HSLS is I train a penalized logistic regression, a lasso regression, and it takes in all 7,000 answer choices and it selects out the ones that are helpful for the prediction task of, is this somebody who checked the male box or the female box at the beginning of the survey? So it picks up on things like how much time you spend playing video games, whether you talk to your friends about your personal problems, whether you imagine that you're going to be a professional athlete or a nurse. So it picks out all the ones that are helpful, weighting up the ones that are more helpful, weighting down the ones that are less helpful. And then summarizing across all of those, it gives each student a predicted probability of having selected the male box or the female box when forced at the beginning of the survey, right? So if you take that new novel empirical quantity, which I have here as the predicted probability of being male. So we've taken those 7,000 questions and we've turned them into this new empirical quantity. If you plot the distribution of that quantity, you get these two spectrums where the people who identified as male are concentrated on the right side with a high predicted probability of being male. People who identified as female are on the left side with a low predicted probability of being male. And yet we see in both of those binary categories, there's a great deal of variability and there's a good amount of overlap. Just as we, of course, know about gender diversity in the world as we see it when not forced into boxes on a survey form. So let's remind ourselves why we did this whole exercise. And it's because I put forward this theory to explain the disparate patterns of gay boys versus lesbian girls. And so now that we have this new novel empirical quantity, we can test this theory directly. So the first part is that gay and lesbian students would feel alienated by or excluded from the gender norms dominant among their schoolmates. So here we have straight males, right? So they're skewed distribution, highly concentrated into the high predicted probability of being male. And yet when we look at gay males, they check the male box, but in all of the 7,000 other answer choices, the way that they're expressing gender through all the ways they're picking their choices is much more expansive. They're spread all throughout the gender distribution rather than just being concentrated all in the high predicted probability of being male. And in other research that I've done that uses, not in this data set, but in other data sets, uses direct measures of gender expression embodied. How masculine or feminine do you feel? Do you feel seen by others? The distribution that you get looks very similar to this kind of thing, where the straight males are highly concentrated and gay males are much more expansive in their felt gender expression. So it reinforces for me the feeling that, you know, if you have enough domains, enough questions that you're asking about, that this approach can capture something meaningful about the experience of gender. So that's for males. And we find the same pattern for females, that lesbian girls are much more expansive in their reporting of gender than straight females are. So we've established this first part, that gay and lesbian students do report very different kinds of gender norms. But what are the academic implications of that? So here I'm going back to bachelor's degrees. And when I've rescaled, so it's no longer the case that male typicalities on the right and female typicalities on the left. Instead, both of them are going the same way. So as you move from 0 to 1, you're moving from the kids who most strongly embody dominant gender norms for their sex category versus the kids who most radically deviate from those gender norms. And what you see is that you have this striking asymmetry where for male identified students, as you move away from dominant ways of doing masculinity, there's a 15 percentage point boost in your likelihood of later being enrolled for a 4-year degree. And for female students, the opposite is true. There's about a 20 percentage point decrease. And this is over and above all the family background characteristics and school fixed effects. And just to say, the binary difference between male and female in the data is about 8 percentage points. So this binary difference that's been the subject of our attention is actually a lot smaller than this spectrum of gender diversity that you see when you open up these binary categories to look at the full distribution of gender expression this way. So that's for self-reported bachelor's degrees. And I find the same pattern for high school GPA as reported on students' official high school transcripts. So both on the self-reported measure and from the transcripts, we find the same asymmetry. And yet, again, when we shift the gaze and focus on reporting discrimination for both male-identified students and female-identified, moving away from the gender norms that are dominant within your school is associated with a doubling of the risk of reporting discrimination. So to conclude, I would offer 2 conclusions. The first is that this rising college gender gap, as important demographic trends of our time, given the kind of far-reaching effects of educational attainment for other demographic issues that we care about, and thinking about work of Princeton OPR affiliates Ann Case and Angus Deaton about just how tremendously consequential the bachelor's degree has become as a dividing line in American life. This rising, growing gap between males and females in educational attainment really is a critical demographic trend. And as sociologists, I think it's okay to admit we're also sociologists, many of us. As sociologists, the question of how gender shapes education is one of the most enduring questions in the sociology of education. And so by making sexuality visible for the first time in our large-scale education data sets, we're able to see this old issue in a new light. But more broadly, I'd also say that studying gay and lesbian students encourages us to find new ways of studying all students. And so in trying to think about how I could capture the gender dynamics that could be underlying the patterns that I found, I developed this computational tool that allows us to inductively measure gender norms within any given survey. And this is a flexible, it's a powerful but limited tool that allows us to tell new kinds of gender stories from the margins of the gender spectrum and not just from the hegemonic center. So thank you.
My name is Stephen Macito, and I teach in the Politics Department, Center for Human Values. I'm not a sociologist, not a demographer, not a quantitative person. The center is post-funding this, so I don't know, but that may be why I'm here. I worked on these issues off and on since the late 80s when I was a graduate student here, from the time of Bowers versus Hardwick, which motivated me strongly in my dissertation, and testified in Colorado Amendment 2 against Robbie George and John Finnis and others, and also wrote a lot in the 90s in favor of same-sex marriage. I've always been pro-marriage, gay, male. That was very unpopular in my first teaching job. at Harvard among queer scholars. It's controversial now still too, I know. But so that's my background, and I wrote this book called Just Married in 2015. The court decided the case a little faster than I expected, though, but not as fast as I hoped. But it defends both same-sex marriage and marriage as a civil institution. Why have marriage as a civil institution, not just contract? I think there's a case for that. Not based on the benefits, but based on the meaning of marriage, the distinct meaning of marriage. And that's why I found the Swedish case quite interesting. First, I thought, and I'll have to say, I'm handicapped by one other thing, which is that we got the slides, which are great slides and they're great papers. The slides raised a number of questions in my mind, and most of the questions were answered in the context of the oral presentation. But the Swedish case, and complexity is added as well. The Swedish case, because fewer social benefits depend upon marriage in Sweden. It's an interesting case, obviously, to study what marriage means apart from needing it in order to get social insurance and other sorts of benefits and legal recognition of the incidence of marriage, which are so important in the United States, where a lot of things depend upon being married. So I found that aspect of the paper quite interesting, though there wasn't all that much on that distinctive question. But that's also, something I'm interested in. And that also raises the question, the third topic of this book I wrote is monogamy. Not monogamy as a moral commitment, but monogamy as part of the legal relationship of marriage as it exists in the United States, obviously. And I tried to take seriously the case monogamy as part of a legal relationship and not in a moralistic way, based partly because all traditional forms of plural marriage basically have been patriarchal, but also because polyamory, which Wendy mentioned, it's not clear to me that it's a marital type relationship. In other words, it's not clear to me that the institution of marriage fits the institution of polyamory. It's not clear to me that polyamorous people want to be married in the way we think of marriage as a distinctive institution in our society. And there's no reason why they should be. Wendy's paper, insofar as it talked about the risk of marriage as almost like a risk of getting COVID or something like that, reminded me of a New Yorker article that came out during the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision about that time. It was a married couple in a New Yorker cartoon. Husband's reading the newspaper, and it says same-sex marriage legalized. And he says, haven't those poor people suffered enough? There's no particular reason why marriage should be favored, I think, by law. Now, I think it is important to explore why many people, not everybody, regards marriage itself, aside from the benefits, as significant. And I think with marriage equality, and actually in conditions where not so many benefits depending upon marriage, that's also something worth studying from an ethnographic perspective. As I was working on this book and talked to same-sex couples and who were married, every single one told me, in many cases, actually heterosexual couples too, who hadn't gotten married but for a long time, but then did. Every single one told me, it was a selective sample, obviously, because of the case I was making, that having gotten married, it surprised them that it actually meant something to them. It meant that it was significant. It changed their understanding of their relationship in a significant positive way. Again, that doesn't mean that marriage should be favored. It doesn't mean that, in my view, that it should be associated with substantial benefits. But I think it should be available as a distinctive relationship for those who wish to join it. Anyway, that's part of my argument. I'm going to be brief because of my lack of expertise on the topic. I found the papers interesting. The gender differences here, obviously across the papers, are incredibly striking and incredibly interesting. The differences between same-sex women and same-sex men are striking, and the tendency, the much greater tendency of same-sex women to have children as well as to get married and to get remarried, and also the greater instability of their relationship. And I guess one question I did have is, given the relationships that Wendy talked about, which full complexity I didn't understand until you discussed them, what effect does the presence of children have on stability? Does it have a positive or negative effect? I don't think that was in the slides, but that's something I'd be curious about. Because 50% of women, I think you said, couples have children within 5 years of getting married or becoming couples. I wasn't sure.
This was a getting married.
Oh, that was what I was getting married. Okay, so it's Sweden. But in any case, that was a question I had. Um, I had questions about the Middleman paper, which was fantastic and incredibly interesting. The reversal of gender dynamics. At first, I thought when I saw the slides that people were reverting to the opposite stereotypes, but they're not. They have a more expansive view, and that is also quite fascinating. And he answered some other questions about what the relationships might be in terms of activities that would be kind of mediating variables, I guess, sports, playing video games, doing things that are associated with gender stereotypes that could also have consequences for academic achievement and so on. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I enjoyed the 3 papers a lot. It's fantastic to see the work that's going on, and thank you for inviting me to comment.
So thank you guys all for your talks. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Alexander Adames, I'm a postdoc here. As some context for my comments, I am a life force sociologist, political demographer, and a pseudo labor economist. Joke. Interested in, among other things, racial inequalities. So, as such, one of the things that struck me about the presentations and pointed out by Wendy, and I think also to some extent Gunnar, is sort of the lack of longitudinal data, especially panel data, to study queer populations. I think this severely limits our capacities as researchers to investigate the development and evolution of queer identities over the life course. How do these identities vary over time within group, between group, and how do these variations affect family formation at different stages in the life course, as well as youth development. So, for example, there's a lot of research on family dynamics that uses dyadic multi-level models to examine the relationship between partners and how that shapes, say, relationship satisfaction, health, etc. I think such approaches would be beneficial to examining queer populations, and can also be extended to parent and youth relationships. The next thing that struck me was how limited we are to, or maybe not struck me because it sort of kind of knew this already, but we're sort of limited to binaristic or discrete measures of sexuality and gender, but also unidimensional. So these types of questions kind of undermine the queer demographic and also sociological conceptions of gender and sexuality. So you're either straight or you're not. You're either a lesbian or you're not. You're trans or you're not. You're a man or you're not. Those things are problematic because I mean, they're obviously important for I think politically and for many other reasons, but they also obscure a lot of variation within groups that may shape inequalities within them and between them. And sort of taking, looking at, when I say unidimensional, I'm sort of thinking of Wendy Rolfe's work in the multiple dimensions of race. I think such work can be extended to sexuality and gender, but most of the questions that we have are either based on or self-identification, so the self, your own evaluation of yourself, and then the research evaluations of these couples. So, pioneer researchers in queer demography, such as Gary, have been forced to, and Wendy, have been forced to look at household rosters and identify whether people are partnered together. And that obviously limits who your identification, who actually is queer. So, and I think that's also distinct from, say, how other people evaluate you or how you perceive other people to evaluate you. Differences in responses to those answers, I think, are potentially have significant ramifications for not only your marital timing, your relationship formation, but also your development as a youth and your transition into adulthood. So I'm going to offer some 2 possible avenues. So what do you do if you don't have millions of dollars to fund a study? I think there are a lot of junior scholars here, such as myself. I don't have a lot of money. So I think there's 2 things we can do. So as I mentioned, I'm a life force sociologist. I generally work with panel data. One of such surveys is the NLSY survey. I'm not sure how common this is, how familiar people are with this, but you can actually propose questions to be added to the NLSY, which is something I'm interested in doing myself. And this would be incredibly beneficial because you can now, given the dearth data, longitudinal data on queer populations, you can now, again, analyze how life force changes for queer populations persist over the course of time, how they compare to their straight counterparts, and how they vary within individuals. Secondly, I think another approach that's also underutilized in demography more broadly is survey experiments. We're often interested in how people, we've talked about how, say, same-sex marriage legislation, access to gender-affirming care, and other transphobic and homophobic policies may shape decisions to move to certain places, seek employment in other places, or fertility decisions. Through, I think, survey experiments, we can learn about decisions people make in facing such challenges. And I know surveys can be expensive, so I'm going to put a plug in for the timeshare experiments for social scientists. So if you have a survey experiment that you're interested in, you can actually just pitch the idea, and they will fund it for you for free. Like, you don't have to pay anything, and they take proposals on a rolling basis. So right now you can submit one and it'll be reviewed. That's the only condition to be accepted to get this to get your study launched. It just has to pass the reviewership. So with these alternative approaches to collecting data on queer demographic populations, I'm hopeful that queer demography can continue to flourish in a new direction. Thank you.
We'll have a few time for questions for the panelists. I guess we'll have Gunnar and Wendy come here, if that's okay. You know, people online, and be sure to see you. And then we also have questions. We also have questions for Joel as well. Feel free to ask him also. Lumia?
I have a question to Joel's presentation.
Okay. Yes, Joel, can you hear?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Probably needs a microphone.
Oh.
Okay. Let's try.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear.
Okay, perfect. So this is really fascinating. So my question is, I wonder if gender atypicality scores, I wonder this score is associated with some, let's say, college application behaviors or some like a college major choice. Because my question is based on my sort of intuition that some educational characteristics are associated with more like male typical or female typical. So like men tend to choose more STEM majors, while women tend to choose more like non-STEM majors. So then let's say men with higher gender atypicality score, are they more likely to choose, let's say, some like a non-STEM majors, or less likely to take like AP Maths maybe, or some other kind of specific kind of college major choice or other kind of educational behaviors? Did you see any differences by atypicality score?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I didn't get into looking at college majors in terms of the question of did they take like kind of more higher level math science classes in high school. They did. It is associated with higher level moving away from dominant ways of masculinity. But the question about college major and then a related payoff of kind of horizontal stratification in terms of the returns to degree, I think is a really important question. And I see Ilya Baschetti is a PhD student at Wisconsin, who I see is on the Zoom right now, and he's done work on exactly that about major choice and payoffs in the labor market for queer college graduates.
Okay, other questions for the panelists?
Awesome. Great talks all around. I'm interested in, I guess, Wendy, one, like what's happening in West Virginia, but also what you see as like, I guess, between the data collection challenges compared to what Gunnar is talking about with the type of data that you all have, right? What do you see as the challenges here in being able to even start to think about why we wouldn't collect data in that way or in that fashion?
It's a great question, and I can't speak to that too directly, except, I mean, in the United States, we just don't have population registers, so all of us in demography are so jealous of everybody in the Scandinavian nations. Yes. Yes. And so we have, yeah, so we don't have quite the same opportunities as I mean, I think our vital statistics system is not even asking. You saw how many states don't even, you can't even determine just the count of the number of couples, but I think there's opportunities, as we've talked about, with panel data. It's difficult because those sample sizes are sometimes very small, and I think one thing I tried to illustrate that I think Danya brought up earlier is we have to really, as demographers, we have to pay attention to age. And so you have to have enough people of different age groups. And so sometimes that becomes problematic in some of our data collections, the birth cohorts, or essentially birth cohorts. And so that can become, they're answering, like the health is great. It's answering about one particular birth cohort as they moved over the life course. So I think getting this information out to data providers, everybody has a different, they have space on surveys is gold, and it's very expensive, as was mentioned. I could give a small plug for the NCHAT. We are optimistic that we'll get a renewal and be able to not only follow up people and have a refresher sample, but we'll also be including an opportunity for individuals to put questions on the survey. And so that's another opportunity for people to try. Maybe this wouldn't be a large enough sample to address that specific question, but maybe some other, it would be an opportunity to try out questions and see how they might work. And so I think there's some opportunities there. Gunnar, I'll let Gunnar answer.
Yes, I can follow. I can just react to your question about the yeah. So what became interesting with this also is the close connection between marriage and childbearing in the different types of couples. Yeah. So for the female same-sex couples, then it is necessary to marry before, because there is a lot of legal ambiguity, so that creates a sense of security. But also in different sex couples, it is really related to having children, and a little bit later on in the career, create some sense of security for the sake of the children. Even in an environment where there is absolutely no public pro-marriage culture, like in the US, and also no pressure from family or peers, but people still marry. So it is an interesting finding, even if it's not related to any economic or other benefits, and also not social pressure. But you had a question about the role of children, and yes, the voice is much lower in children, and that is in all kind of units. And in our models that I presented, then it is multivariate models where you control for the composition of having children or not, and other characteristics. And then with the data, with American data, I just know that there are progress with Social Security system type register data by a team in Boulder in Colorado. So there's a forthcoming in the demography. Maybe I think it's even online a paper there. But I have no idea what kind of marital list there is or things like that. But I know that you can do life course research based on in the future based on this data.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
I'm gonna take the ability as like organizer to insert my own question for what I'm curious. One thing that neither one of you had the chance to bring up in your talk is selection into marriage. Do the processes of selection into marriage differ in your study between same-sex and opposite-sex couples? The pathways into marriage differ.
So we kind of have some crude ways of looking at that, so we can look at what are the characteristics of people who are married, and do we have differences in terms of home ownership or income, and we do see quite positive selection into marriage for same-sex couples as well as different sex couples. So I don't think there's something unique about that. It seems my hypothesis at the outset was really thinking that the value of marriage might be especially high for same-sex couples, especially those who want to have children or raise children together, and that there might be less selection into marriage. And so I think that's a good question, but we do know quite a bit about that from the American Community Survey. So
yeah, it depends also what you mean with selection. One can see that the age profiles are very different. So the different sex people marry much younger ages, and the female couples later, and the male couples later. So in that kind, there is a more stumble blocks and a longer process to get into marriage. That kind of selection.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for everyone on the panel. Give one last round of applause.